So just as a reminder, this week we're talking about professional codes of ethics. So I know we just had our case study, but let's think back to the time before that when we had our activity of going online and looking at the professional codes of ethics for a whole bunch of different jobs across different sectors and things like that. So these professional codes of ethics inform the ethical standards for that profession itself. And if you'll remember, it's usually published by some kind of accrediting body or association associated with that profession, right? So let's talk for just a little bit about the purpose of these codes of ethics. So let's just reiterate this again. So the first objective for these codes of ethics is number one, they can constrain, guide, and inspire the administrators themselves. Okay. So if a given profession wants to inform or constrain behavior, if they're worried about having bad actors in their profession, this is one of the ways that they can try to rein that behavior in. Okay. And so oftentimes these codes will contain tenets. Tenets is just a fancy word for just basic statements, right? Um, that say, and we went over the four different kinds, right? So there are the don't statements, there are obligations and requirements, there are virtue statements, and there are aspirations. So we have these four different kinds of tenets that'll reveal themselves in these codes. They also take a chance or they provide the ability for them to outline micro standards versus macro standards. So we're trying to, the code is trying to set standards, right? And it does this at two levels. The micro level is at the individual level. So it's trying to set the standards for individuals. Like you as a person, this is what we expect you to be doing. But then they also take a little broader approach too, if you'll remember, with some of their aspirational statements to set the macro standards, to set the behavior for the field as a whole, right? So they're not talking about individual behavior when they're talking about that. They're talking about like what we hope everyone views our profession as, right? So if you think about like this can be used to discipline members by contrasting the micro standards with the macro standards. So if the individual's micro behavior does not fit with the macro standards, then they have reason to discipline that individual, right? So they're trying to bridge that gap between micro and macro. Okay. And then it offers the standards for practice. So if you think about the term best practice, right? The term best practice usually in the workplace denotes a tried and true method, something we expect everyone to do. It's the best way of doing things. This is essentially what that is in an ethical context. So the profession is essentially saying, so they may publish best practice for like zookeeping, right? Like on one hand, you may have like best practices for like how to take care of animals, but then they will also publish like here are the best practices for ethical behavior. Here are things that like 99.9 times out of 100, these are what it means to act ethically. Okay. Okay. Second objective. Codes can be used as a means of enforcing the shared standards of the profession. So if you think of these associations as kind of guardians or keepers of the flame, right? They think it's their duty, their responsibility to ensure that the reputation of the profession is safeguarded. So lawyers association probably don't want people to think that all lawyers are greedy, shady, lying people, right? Like they have an interest in trying to make sure that the members of their profession are giving them a good name and representing them well, right? Because all it takes is one or two bad apples to spoil the whole bunch, right? For the public to view that profession as being bad. Okay, so that's the second way, is that it gives them a means of enforcing those standards and guarding those standards. Okay, and then objective number 3, codes alert persons outside of the profession of what they can and should expect. So in the public sector context, this could include like the clients and customers or citizens that interact with public administrators. So if I'm going to the DMV and I'm expecting to work with a government bureaucrat, then I can, and if I believe that I've been treated poorly in that instance, I can go perhaps to the ethical code of standards for government, right? And I can actually point out and say, this is how I expect to be treated when I interact with government workers based on your standards. And that was not the way I was treated, okay? And so what it does is it provides a means by which the public, we as the public, can hold public administrators accountable. On the flip side, this can also be like aspirants to the profession. So if you're thinking about getting into a given profession, it would probably be a good idea to look up their code of ethics and see what's expected of you and whether or not that aligns with your personal code of ethics, and whether or not you would be able to adhere to those ethics. So it gives you a better view for people outside of the profession of what they're signing up for if they come into the profession, or what they can expect if they have to interact with someone of this profession, and so that they can hold them accountable. Okay, so that kind of jogs our memory a little bit about codes of profession, why we have them, the purpose that they serve. Okay, I want to move the discussion to talking about enforcement mechanisms for codes of ethics. So this is one of the main critiques of codes of ethics. Essentially says if codes of ethics don't have any kind of enforcement mechanism, then they really have no impact. So if there's no way to enforce it, then all they are just like nice sentiments, like that make us feel warm and fuzzy inside, right? That's about it. Unless they have some actual real enforcement mechanisms. So effective codes, they require some kind of implementation, right? So you can't just write this codified document and publish it and not expect to actually implement it and to support that. Implementation involves the capacity to, number one, interpret the code. So this is one area that can be difficult when drafting the code. How explicit do you need to be in the code so that the areas where you don't want any interpretation are very clearly understood, or the areas where there's maybe some discretion or interpretation involved to be a little bit more abstract about it and to allow for some of that interpretation, or to give delegated authority as to who can interpret, okay, that code. And then 2, they can provide education and training. So this can happen company-wide, it can happen profession-wide. So a company can do ethics trainings, right? That can take the standards of these codes of ethics and do trainings and practice and help them become more educated and well-versed about their own ethics training. But that even happens with an association, right? So an association may hold huge conferences. ASPA, we talked about ASPA last time. ASPA holds a huge national conference every year where both scholars, public administration scholars, and public administration practitioners, they all come together and they talk about all of the issues with the profession in the field. Ethics is definitely one of those things, right? So it gives them an opportunity to educate and train their employees. And then finally, in order to implement it, you also have to enforce it, okay? So what does an enforcement process look like? How do we set this up? Well, let's take, for example, the ICMA. So the ICMA is the International Association for City Managers, so local government employees, okay? And so give you just a little bit of an idea here of what this looks like. So for the ICMA, the executive director is advised by the Committee on Professional Conduct, CPC. So they've established a committee on professional conduct. And the executive director, it makes an initial determination about whether a complaint is covered by ICMA's ethical standards. So if someone thinks that wrongdoing has been committed, they can complain to the executive director and the CPC. And the executive director makes a judgment. Again, we're looking at discretion here about whether a complaint is covered if it falls under the ICMA standards. And if so, then the CPC begins investigation. Well, how do they investigate? Well, first of all, they put together a fact-finding committee of ICMA members who are close to the site of the complaint. So if this were to happen in like a given local government, they would probably go to ICMA members, local government professionals occurring around this local government, right? So they're obviously going to try to avoid conflicts of interest. They're not going to choose people that were involved in the situation, but they're going to try and pick people who, number one, have membership in ICMA and who are members of the profession, but number two, have some kind of better access to the information there and knowledge there. Okay, so they're going to start a fact-finding committee and investigate the issue. If the CPC makes a determination and then the CPC makes its determination, it recommends what action should be taken. If the complaint is upheld, there are a few options as far as what can happen as a result of this, okay? So on the one hand, they can give a private censure. It's delivered to the respondent with copies to the complainant and the state association. So they write them a letter that says, you acted unethically. It's just a private thing that's copied to some of the higher ups, okay? But more, other than that, no one else needs to know. Additionally, they can also make a public censure, or they can also suspend their membership in the association, or like if they're licensed by that association, right? They could suspend the license for up to 5 years. Okay, that's a fairly newer one. And then ultimately, if it was grievous enough of an act, they can expel them from membership and prevent them from joining it ever again, okay? So that's, again, the more extreme of the kind. But these are the options that they have available to them for enforcement, right? Again, we're talking about the fact that if there is no enforcement mechanism, then there really is there's no point in having these ethical codes of ethics, okay? So if any of these decisions are made, then the individual can appeal to the executive board, and the final decision is implemented by the executive director. Okay, so this gives you a little bit of an idea of, in one instance, how they have set up a framework for enforcing their codes of ethics. Okay, so you can see that the possible censures and consequences are pretty steep. If the offense is grievous enough, you could end up being kicked out of the profession, right? So it matters, right? That's the message that the ICMA is sending, is that these aren't just platitudes. We actually care about this and we're going to enforce it, okay? So what exactly are the factors that are taken into consideration when determining the sanctions? So we outlined the process for ICMA, right? But let's unpack the black box a little bit of what that looks like. So when the CPC is sitting down and trying to determine what should we do with this individual, what do they take into consideration? Well, the text outlines a number of factors here. So first, there's the nature of the violation. How bad is it, right? Is this something that's just like, ugh, that wasn't great? Or was this like a heinous act that needs serious consequences, right? That's going to put us at serious risk, or that did serious financial or mental, right, damage to employees or the company itself. There's also whether or not prior violations have occurred by the same individual. So is this the first time this person has ever done something? Or is this like the third time and we've warned this person that this is going to occur and they continue to make mistakes, okay? Third is the willfulness of the violation, okay? Was this inadvertent? Was it an accident? Or did they full well know what they were doing and did it willingly, right? That's probably going to play a factor in how you respond to this. And then there's also the level of professional or public responsibility of the individual. Let me ask you why you think that is. The level of professional or public responsibility of the individual. So if the person's well known, we may need to make a more public correction, right? So if a nobody in this government agency, if it's just like somebody that no one knows did something wrong, do I need to necessarily make a full-blown public statement that, you know, some 22-year-old startup like employee did something bad? No, right? Like no one's going to care. No one's concerned about that, right? But if the agency head that everyone knows and who has huge decision-making authority made that kind of violation, then let's see. Then people associate that with the agency itself, right? Everyone's going to know about that, regardless of how well we may try to keep it under wraps. And so we want to make a public statement that corrects that. Okay, so that's why, given, you know, how much responsibility they have, or how much like public I don't know the word I'm looking for, their popularity maybe, or their how much they're known across the public is going to play a factor in that. Okay, and then finally we also have any other factor that bears on the seriousness of the violation. So if you look at this here, this is a statement from a former CPC member back in 2005, talking about kind of this process and how they weigh these things. And he suggests that the two that I've bolded here, prior violations by the same individual and willfulness of the violation, are really the two that hang most heavily on this decision process. Okay, so he says if there are prior violations by the same individual and this has been brought to the individual's attention, then the re-education has been attempted and failed. Prior violations make a decision easier. The willfulness of the violation comes into play a lot. Was it someone making a stupid mistake, or what could have been a stupid mistake, or was it someone acting with malice aforethought? Okay, so it's going to be circumstantial, right? We want to take it depending on what happened and what were the circumstances surrounding it. Okay, now this is also kind of interesting. So our text gives us a little bit of a glimpse into like, what does unethical behavior look like? Like, what are the actual violations that are occurring, right? Does this stuff actually happen? Like, is the ICMA really having to enforce these codes of ethics, or is this, again, just something like a nice platitude document that they put out? Okay, so a study was done that looked at the ICMA and their violations of code of ethics from 1990 to 2009. Okay, so you've got nearly a 20-year period here. And this is, again, it's a little old, but this gives you a good glimpse, right? This is 20 years worth of data. During that time period, the ICMA issued 79 public censures. So again, not private, these are public censures related to 133 ethics violations. Okay, now if we were to break that down, of those 79, 49% violated tenet 3 in their code of ethics, which is about honor and integrity to merit public confidence. Interesting. Isn't that interesting? The most common ethics violation has nothing to do with duty, has nothing to do with the aspirations or like the don't statements, right? Don't do this, don't do that. It's about virtue. It's about not having the character that would be necessary to merit confidence, public confidence, right? So it's essentially saying like your character is undermining the public confidence in our organization. Okay, interesting here. So 20% of the 79 violated tenet 2, which is affirming dignity and worth of the services rendered by government. And then 16% violated tenet 12, so not seeking favors or benefiting unduly from public office. Okay, these are all public censures. There were 106 private censures. Okay, they don't break these down into groups in the same way, but 106 private censures. Across all of these violations, 33 included misuse of funds or property. Okay, and then there weren't any censures regarding major responsibilities to the city council, which comprised of 3 different tenants, and only 1 regarding merit in personnel matters, like hiring. And then there were 10 violations classified under tenants involving sexual harassment or discrimination. Now, again, this was, a little over a decade ago. I would imagine, if I were to guess here, that that last number, as far involving sexual harassment or discrimination, has probably increased. Probably because we are doing a better job at having report mechanisms for that kind of harassment, right? But this kind of gives you the landscape, right? So when you get into a public sector organization and you're thinking, what could possibly go wrong? Like, what are people actually doing? This gives you an idea of what can actually happen, and that it's actually real, that you have a very real risk of getting publicly censured by the organization, or at the very best, getting a private censure from the organization. And if it's bad enough, being expelled from the profession. Okay, so this gives you kind of a look at enforcement. Okay, if we were to do this across different professions, we would probably find different mechanisms for how they enforce their codes of ethics across different professions. The point is that there needs to be some kind of ethics of enforcement. Okay, you've heard me say it before, but the document has to have teeth. It has to have the ability to bite on and do something about it, to actually get movement, right? Otherwise, it's useless.